Hello friends, welcome back to Digitalk. So in this session, I am going to cover a few important concepts of the data source connection pool in WebLogic. Okay, so I have been getting multiple requests to explain the connection pool again. Along with that, the JNDI of the data source, how the application actually connect with the database. That means when application need a connection, so how it connect to the data source and to get the connection from the connection pool or from the database. And then the difference between initial, minimum, and maximum capacity. So in this short session, I am going to explain all these terms in a very simple way so that you will get a complete understanding, which is very important from the tuning perspective as well. So overall understanding of the data source connection pool in terms of the application connectivity, and then to perform the performance tuning as well. Right. So now what exactly is the connection pool? So we know about the connection pool is a part of your data source, and why we configure it. We configure to get the connection from the database. So this is your WebLogic, and here we configure the data source where we have the connection pool, right? And this connect with the database for the connection. So that means if any application, okay, going to connect to your WebLogic, which need the connection from the database, okay, it will take the help of your data source. And inside the data source, we have the connection pool. Right. So what is connection pool? Is connection pool is a ready to use connections. Ready to use connections means the connections that has been already established with the database. Okay, for example, if I say my connection pool capacity is 15, so we have a initial, minimum, and maximum. I will explain about that. So initially, let's understand that if I say my connection pool capacity is 50, okay, so that means in the connection pool, okay, there will be around 50 already established connections, ready to use connections. That means these 50 connections are already established with the database. So if any application which need to connect with the database, it will come to your data source connection pool, and it will pick the connection from the ready to use connections. That means runtime, at the runtime, your data source, okay, not required to reach to a database and then create the connection, which is just an overhead, right? Because if you do not have ready to use connections, then when your application need the connection, it will reach to a data source, and then during the requirement, it will reach to database, then it will create the connection, and then it will hand over to the application, which is reduce the performance. So for that, we need a ready to use connections. That means the connection which is already established to your database, right? So this increase the performance of your application. Right, so this is now the connection pool. So now this how this application connect to your database. So here in the WebLogic, I have my applications deployed, right? So this application connect to your data source, and data source reach to your database for the connection. So now how this application connect to my data source? I may have a multiple data source in my WebLogic. Data source 1, 2, 3, and then 4. And similarly, I have the multiple application deployed. Application 1, application 2, application 3. I have multiple applications. So how my application know that which data source I need to connect, right? So for that, it actually use the JNDI, Java Naming Directory Interface. So when we configured a data source, okay, we need to specify a JNDI for our connection pool, or you can say for the data source, right? So whatever the JNDI that we specify during the configuration of your data source, same JNDI need to define in your application code. Right. Now, for example, I have an application, payment application, which I have deployed, payment.war. And this application need to connect to the database. And for this application, during the coding, I have specified my JNDI name as con pool slash JNDI. Right. So now when you are going to configure this data source in your WebLogic, so you need to use the same JNDI in your connection pool or in the data source. So now your application, whenever your application is deployed, okay, and this need the connection with the database, so it will always look for the JNDI tree of your WebLogic, and from the JNDI tree, it will look for this particular JNDI name. And now this JNDI is belong to the connection pool or data source that you have configured, so it will reach to the data source, and then it will reserve the connection. Now, so that means it's a very simple forward way when we specifically talk about the what is the JNDI in the data source. Okay, so JNDI it is which is a lookup service which your application need to connect with the database. So this is your WebLogic. Here my payment application. payment.var file which I have deployed. In this application, I have specified the JNDI name, like as I said, conpool slash JNDI. So when I'm going to configure my data source, okay, during configuration of my data source, I will give the same JNDI name. And whenever this application need the connection, it will look for the your WebLogic JNDI tree, which you can see from the console as well. In this JNDI tree, it will look for this particular JNDI name, and then it will reach the corresponding data source, and then this data source will reach to your end database. So by this way, your application use the JNDI name. Right. So now hope connection pool is clear to you. Along with that, JNDI is clear to you how your application reached to your connection pool. Now, what is initial, minimum, and maximum capacity? So let me clear you on these three concepts as well. Okay. What is initial capacity? What is minimum capacity? And what is maximum capacity? So your initial capacity, minimum capacity, and maximum capacity. Right. So what I said to you about the connection pool, it is a ready to use connections. Right. Ready to use connections. That means it is already established connections with the database. If I'm saying 50, that means there are 50 connections, those already established with the database. Correct. So now what is initial, minimum, and maximum capacity of a connection pool? Okay. So whenever we create the data source, okay, we specify these three settings: initial, minimum, and maximum. Okay. So maximum capacity is the total number of connections that your data source can create with the database. That means if we have created a data source in WebLogic, which is going to connect to the database, I have given the max capacity as 50. So that means your application at a time can create maximum 50 connections, or you can say maximum 15 concurrent connections. It cannot go beyond that one. If your application need 51 connection at a time and the capacity is 15, so 15 will serve the request, one will go in queue to wait the connections, and once your 50 connection, any of the connections out of 50 is released, then okay, it is going to serve the remaining the request which is more than 50, like the next one request. Okay, or if it is the time of the request is exceeded, then you will see the exception in your log file that connection pool is out of the resources. Okay, so this is the maximum capacity, the total number of connections that can stay in your connection pool at a time. So that means whenever you configure the data source, okay, you should have a knowledge about your application, what is the expected number of connections that is application is going to create. If it is a very heavy application where we have a large number of user base, large number of requests are coming, which has a dependency on database, okay, so you need to increase this capacity. Okay, and you can gradually check that one. Initially, if you think that 200 connections will be sufficient, then gradually you have to increase it based on the utilization of your application. Right. So this is the maximum capacity, the total number of connections your application can create in a database concurrently. Okay. Now, what is initial and minimum capacity? Okay. So now, as I said, maximum capacity is the total maximum connections that your application can create in the database. If I expecting 100 number of concurrent connection in my database, then doesn't mean these 100 connections my application always going to use, right? So out of 24 hours, it may be possible that for 6 hours of a time, okay, application is under heavy load and utilizing the all 100 connections, but remaining of the hours, that means for remaining 18 hours of the day, okay, it may be using 40 connections, 50 connections, 30 connections, something like that one. So the maximum capacity we have to define based on the maximum connections we are expecting, right? But as I said, the normal time it is using 30, 40, or 50 connections. So what we do, because these all 100 connections, if it is the capacity which is going to connect to your database, okay, so these are the ready to use connections. That means they are taking the resources of your system, of your application server, of your database as well, because these are the established connections. That means already connected sessions. So if it is connected sessions, that is going to take the resources. So if for 18 hours of a time your requirement is 30, 40, 50 connections, then why you want 100 connection to be there, which is unnecessarily consuming the resources? So for that we have the minimum capacity, right? So what is the minimum number of connections? So during non-peak hours, I am expecting that 50 connections will be there. So you can specify 50 as the minimum capacity, right? So that means your regular time, the total number of connection in your connection pool will be 50. Okay, and during the peak hours when you have a 6 hour of a time, okay, your application demand will increase. So these 50 connections can go up to 100 connections, right? So 50, suppose 10 more requests came, so now the connection will be 60, so it will reserve 10 more connections. So similarly it can go up to the 100, right? So this is the way how we manage the minimum and maximum capacity. But from performance tuning perspective, you will see the recommendation where minimum capacity should equal to maximum. Okay, this is because to increase the further performance, because as I said, 50 connections we have defined and my application needs 60 connection if some time. So remaining 10 of the connections going to be established at the runtime from your database. So this is again some performance overhead. So this is the recommendation. You should specify minimum as maximum, but this is not true in all the cases. Okay, depend on the utilization of your application. Otherwise, you will unnecessarily killing your resources by specifying the maximum number of connections. Okay, so minimum connections means the number of connections that will always be available in your connection pool. If you define 50, then irrespective of the utilization, whether application is using or not using, you will always have the 50 connections in your connection pool. Okay, which can go up to the 100 during the load. Now, what is initial connection? So initial connection is which is something established when we start the services, or when you can say when we start the data source, or when we start the managed server. Let me explain you that also. Okay, so now this is my WebLogic and my managed server 1, and to this managed server I have attached the data source 1, and which have a connection pool with the minimum capacity 50, maximum capacity 100, and now initial capacity I have defined 20. Okay, so what will happen when I will restart my managed server, or when I will restart my data source? During the restart, initially it will assign 20 number of connections. That means it will establish the 20 number of connections immediately when you are going to restart your services. Okay, and that means this is the number of connections that will establish to your database immediately as soon as you will start your services. So as soon as your data source is going to be initialized, it will reach the database and it will establish the 20 connections. And these 20 connections will be available for your application immediately. As soon as your service are started, your application may need the connection immediately as soon as the applications are active. So these 20 connections will be ready for your application, right? So minimum capacity is the number of connections that will always be remain in your connection pool. Maximum capacity is the maximum number of concurrent connection that your application can create to data source. On top of this, if extra requests are there, they have to wait, or you will get the exception. The connection pool is out of reach. Okay. Apart from that, initial capacity is like 20, which is the minimum connection that you are expecting when your service is started. It will be established to your database as soon as your services are started. Okay, and after that, once your application has been started and initial connections has been established, if your application need more connections, then minimum capacity is there to serve that. And if the demand increase, then 100 capacity is there, okay, for your applications. And for this also you will see the recommendation. You can define the initial capacity equal to the minimum capacity. So the generic recommendation you will see like this one. Initial capacity you can define as the minimum capacity, and minimum capacity you can define as the maximum capacity. That means all three are equal. Initial equal to minimum equal to maximum. Okay, but this is again a performance overhead, because this will be the total number of connections that will be established to your database irrespective of the utilization, whether your application is using or not. If you have defined 100, then 100 connection always be there in your database, which you will see in your database table as well, whether your application using that or not. So that means when you are doing the tuning of all these parameters, it completely depends on the your application, load of your application, and specifically the number of connections that you are expecting in your database by the application.